Russia has gone through an attempt of an armed rebellion. Fighters of the private military company Wagner, led by Yevgeny Prigozhin, captured the major city of Rostov-on-Don and headed towards Moscow. President Putin declared the rebels as traitors and promised to punish them severely. Military columns of Wagner stopped about 150 miles from the capital of Russia. Prigozhin stated that he didn't want to shed blood, turned his forces around and returned them to their field camps. My name is Dmitry Kolesev. I'm a Russian journalist, and in this video I will explain what happened in Russia and what consequences it will have. The private military company Wagner appeared in 2014. It has no legal status in Russia. The Kremlin has used it as a proxy force to interfere in conflicts around the world, from Ukraine to Africa. Yevgeny Prigozhin, a man with a criminal past and a small-scale oligarch, was at the head of the PMC Wagner from the beginning, but the PMC was under Kremlin control. When Putin began losing war in Ukraine, the mercenaries of the PMC Wagner were sent to Ukraine and they entered into battle. Wagner turned out to be more effective than the clumsy and corrupt Russian army. To increase the number of mercenaries, Prigozhin received permission from the Kremlin to recruit prisoners. Thus, many killers and robbers ended up in the ranks of Wagner during the war. The PMC Wagner turned into a full-fledged army with its own armored vehicles, reconnaissance, aviation and air defense. Prigozhin didn't spare the lives of soldiers and, with the help of brutal assaults, was able to achieve some success. His fighters took the towns of Solidar and Bakhmut. In the circles of National-Patriots, Prigozhin began to earn a reputation as a hero and the most successful military leader. The leadership of the regular army didn't like this state of affairs. They entered into a conflict with Prigozhin and began to obstruct him. Yevgeny Prigozhin, in response, publicly criticized and humiliated the army leadership. Prigozhin, who was a very secretive person 2 years ago, became a public figure. He started recording videos criticizing the military, the government and the oligarchs. At first, he criticized the inefficiency of the army, but then he went so far as to call the war itself a mistake. He withdrew his forces from Bakhmut without orders and accused the army of hindering his retreat by mining the roads. The Wagner militants even took a lieutenant colonel of the Russian army captive and forced him to apologize on camera. In early June 2023, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu ordered all volunteer units, including the PMC Wagner, to sign contracts with the Ministry of Defense. This would mean the transfer of Wagner under Shoigu's control. Putin supported this decision. Prigozhin publicly stated that he wouldn't do this. On the evening of June 23, Prigozhin claimed that the Ministry of Defense had supposedly launched a missile strike on the field camps of the PMC Wagner. It's quite possible that this was a lie, but Prigozhin used it as a pretext to announce the March of Justice. In fact, this was a military rebellion. Columns of PMC Wagner troops left their camps and headed towards Moscow. Prigozhin stated that he didn't intend to overthrow the government, but only wanted to stop the military leadership of the country, the defense minister and the chief of the general staff. First, they captured Rostov-on-Don, a major city in southern Russia. The headquarters of the Southern Military District is located here. From this place, Russia's military operation in Ukraine is being controlled. Here were Sergei Shoigu and Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov, whom Prigozhin declared his personal enemies. Shoigu flew to Moscow and Gerasimov disappeared somewhere in the city. Prigozhin troops entered the city, blocked the buildings of the security forces and captured the headquarters of the military district. Prigozhin didn't take officers captive and offered them to continue working. For a day, Rostov-on-Don became the temporary base of the PMC Wagner. In fact, the city was controlled by the rebels. The rebels did not terrorize civilians and limited themselves to demonstrating their power. Tanks and Wagner military forces stood on the square near the military headquarters. A crowd of people gathered. Some expressed support for the PMC Wagner, while others argued with them. At the same time, many people tried to leave the city. Food was running out in the stores and queues were forming at gas stations. Over the past 20 years, Vladimir Putin has systematically destroyed public politics in Russia and destroyed democratic institutions. He has built an unjust and inhumane political regime that relies on repression and lies. Society has accumulated many unresolved problems, and there are no mechanisms for their peaceful resolution. People have little democratic experience to soberly assess populist speeches. That's why Yevgeny Prigozhin became quite popular. Prigozhin stayed in Rostov, while the Wagner PMC columns moved towards Moscow along the highway. They were trying to stop them with dump trucks and roadblocks. Nevertheless, Wagner was moving forward quite quickly. They didn't try to capture other major cities and were headed towards the capital. President Vladimir Putin spoke in a video address on the morning of June 24, calling what was happening treason, urging them to stop and promising to punish the rebels. The Federal Security Service initiated a criminal case of armed rebellion. In response, Yevgeny Prigozhin stated that the president was mistaken. Prigozhin said he would not admit guilt and would continue the so-called March of Justice. Attempts were made to use aviation against the rebels, but the Wagner PMC was able to shoot down 8 helicopters and 1 military passenger plane. The losses of aviation in one day became the largest since the beginning of the war against Ukraine. According to various estimates, 13 to 30 pilots were killed. The Wagner PMC column was led by Dmitry Utkin, a former military man who adheres to Nazi views. To stop them, defensive structures were erected closer to Moscow. It was planned to stop Wagner on the Oka River, which allowed Moscow to be defended from the south for centuries. Bridges were blocked and checkpoints were set up on the Oka River. The defense of Moscow was complicated by the fact that the majority of capable units of the Russian army are fighting in Ukraine. The war has greatly exhausted the army. Only 2 divisions are defending the capital of Russia, but it's unknown how loyal they are to Putin. According to rumors, many junior and middle officers support Prigozhin as they are dissatisfied with the leadership of the Ministry of Defense and the situation in the country. Propaganda claimed that the President Putin remained in Moscow, but flight tracking services recorded the departure of government planes to St. Petersburg. Perhaps Putin and his people were afraid and left the capital. Nevertheless, representatives of the political elite publicly expressed support for Putin and condemned the rebels. It seemed like the battle for Moscow would soon begin and Wagner would try to seize power in the capital, and that means throughout Russia. But around 8 o'clock in the evening on June 24, the press service of the President of Belarus announced that the president of this country, Alexander Lukashenko, had held talks with the leader of the Wagner PMC, Yevgeny Prigozhin, and he had agreed to stop the columns. Prigozhin confirmed that he decided to stop in order not to shed Russian blood, as he put it. The Wagner PMC column did turn around and went back. In Rostov-on-Don, the Wagner PMC fighters also began leaving their positions. They headed back to their field camps. The rebellion ended. The press secretary of the President of Russia, Dmitry Peskov, stated that Yevgeny Prigozhin and the participants in the rebellion would not be prosecuted under the law and the criminal case against them would be terminated. According to the agreements, Prigozhin will leave Russia and go to Belarus, and some of the Wagner PMC fighters will sign contracts with the Ministry of Defense. The result of the rebellion are not yet clear. Yevgeny Prigozhin failed to capture Moscow and overthrow Putin, but perhaps he didn't have such a goal. Perhaps he just wanted to get guarantees of security for himself and declare himself as a political figure. He succeeded in doing this. Now much will depend on further events. If Putin dismisses Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov, it means that Prigozhin was able to make Putin do so. But Putin may buy time, try to destroy Wagner PMC with intrigue and deception. He may also try to kill Yevgeny Prigozhin in Belarus. President of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, is a close ally of Putin, so it is unlikely that Prigozhin will receive serious protection in Belarus. However, the rebellion demonstrated the weakness of the Putin state. The police, National Guard and army couldn't stop several thousand armed people who quickly broke through to Moscow in one day. The regime looks weak and vulnerable. This increases the risk of a military coup, new rebellions or a civil war. It is possible that Putin will respond to the attempted rebellion with a new wave of repression, including towards his own supporters and representatives of the National-Patriotic camp. However, the Russian elite must understand that the rebellion was a result of Putin's own mistakes. He unleashed a criminal war, but was unable to win it. He himself raised a private army, depriving the state of a monopoly on violence. He was unable to resolve the dispute between the army and the Wagner PMC and brought the situation to rebellion. He was unable to suppress this rebellion and only managed to persuade the rebels to step back. Moreover, formally speaking, the savior turned out to be the leader of a foreign state, Alexander Lukashenko. This means that Putin is weak and letting go of his power. Therefore, what has happened may only be the first act, and new shocks await Russia. My name is Dmitry Kolesev. Subscribe to this channel to learn about events in Russia, receive analysis and commentary. Tap like button to support the video and support the channel on Patreon. Thank you. Take care of yourself.